Now, we know from previous instalments that seeking step is one of our most fundamental steps in each one that we use particularly for stepping forwards. And we know that the foot hits the floor at quite a low angle, so it's a little bit like an arrow hitting into the floor, but it's a very flat angle. The ball of the foot hits first, and then the heel of the foot hits second. And we also know that this has evolved over time through what we call over-determination. So there are multiple reasons why we want to do this. One is so that we minimise slip risks, because the ball of the foot can land and then the heel can land and stabilise the posture. It's by no means 100% guarantee, but it shifts the odds in favour of a safer landing. And then secondly, the posture helps to protect the ankle a little bit. And this is where things start to get a little bit more complicated. Because the second reason for doing a seeking step is to use rebound energy, setting a posture. So when the heel hits the floor, that helps to stabilise the whole structure. And if we can time it just right with the Farley, so that the heel hits the floor, broadly speaking at the same time as a punch hits the target, then we've set the posture, we've solidified it. However, you can see pretty clearly here that my foot doesn't stay completely straight even when I'm doing the jab. And this is because we have the template posture, and then we have the application posture, and the template posture will always be perfect, but then when you add power, it will always distort the structure. It's just inevitable, and I've talked about this before. For all the benefits of slow movement, if you don't then bring it up into faster, more powerful movements, you'll never understand this. So we practice it perfectly, and then we let the power itself distort the structure out of line. But the body itself is trying to do the perfect foot posture, and that's what really counts, keeping that intentionality there. The danger, of course, is that the more that the foot turns to the side, the more chance there is of it going over on the ankle. And what's actually a little bit more important than the actual positioning of the foot is the intent in the foot, or we should say the intention in the foot, so the mindfulness in the foot, keeping that sense of whole body integrated structure even in the ankle joint. Remember that whole body unified force isn't some quality of the body as such, it's a quality of the mental instruction to hold the overall consistency of the structure together. A little bit like if you tense your whole body, that's in the mind. It's a physically manifested response to a command, but the command is ultimately in the mind. Whole body unified force is a very similar idea. And the way to achieve this with the footwork is just like this, just like on screen now. Lots of very relaxed drills where we're very mindful of the intention in the lower body. So we really put our full intentionality into the legs, into the feet, into the consistency of the structure. And we do that because we want to bring it into our consciousness, and then eventually it will just go into a kind of, let's not say subconscious, but you don't have to think about it, much like we can bring breathing into our consciousness and then it goes back into not being conscious. And eventually that ensures that we're not haphazard with our footwork. And we really need this, by the way. So there's a point in the Book of Five Rings where Miyamoto Musashi says that you shouldn't focus on any kind of fancy footwork, even though he does actually give some tips on footwork. But the difference with a sword is you don't need to set the posture. You can set a posture with a sword, and you do with each one's sword. But it's nowhere near as important to maximise force generation from a smaller movement, because a sword is sharp and pointed and you don't need much force just to stick it in somebody. But to transmit force from an Yiquan jab where it sets on the front foot, very much like Xing Yiquan, you do need to think about setting. And also remember, as intermediate learners, don't lose track of these ideas. It's a distributed set, so the rear foot comes in very fast after the lead foot, and the set is distributed overall across 2 feet, but it's primarily on the front foot. So it's very important to get this right. But it is much more about the timing than it is specifically about the angle of the foot. Ideally, the foot would be straightforward, but lots of things change when you do things with power, as I've mentioned before. As long as the correct intentionality is there in the foot, that you don't lose track, you don't have a weak ankle joint, and the foot doesn't turn too far over, and your weight isn't, critically, your weight isn't too far over the foot so that it risks pushing the ankle out. So when we practice with the seeking step pointing forwards, and we let power distort it out of line, but because we have our intentionality in it, we never lose track of whole body unified force, even in our lower body. Now, let's say we want to make a change and we want to do a lead hand hook. And this means that the template posture for the seeking step is also going to change, that it's going to be slightly more of an angle deliberately. One of the things this does is it makes it much harder to just slide the foot down into a heel set. Although when we do it with power with the jab, we do that anyway, so it's not really that much different. Where there's a difference is when we think about Xing Yiquan and traditional Wushu, and a much stricter requirement to keep the foot pointing forwards. So this is more about your understanding of the differences between the Yiquan innovations and traditional Wushu. A stricter requirement for keeping the foot pointing forwards mitigates against the development of hook-style postures, which you almost never see in Xing Yiquan. If you do, it's always an exotic posture in an exotic form. But each one is led by the physiology of the body, the science of the physiology of the body, so it allows for this to develop. Now, in theory, this makes a difference to the set of the posture because the foot is on a slightly different angle to the jab. In reality, as we've seen, because power makes the body rotate around the central axis, it doesn't actually make that much of a difference. And that's not what we're particularly interested in today. Rather, what I want to look at now is how the posture itself has structural sympathy with the next step. Well, that of course depends on what the next step is, but the next step that we're going to demonstrate, how the hook naturally suggests physiologically that it has structural sympathy with another kind of posture to follow on. First, let's look carefully at the template posture and also listen. And when you listen, you can hear the distributed set. So I'm not doing it incredibly powerful here, so I won't say something as grand as Fa Li, but you can see the way the distributed set is timed with the hip point. So the 2 feet setting the posture very close to one another in timing, in perfect timing with hitting the hip point. Okay, so now let's start thinking about structural sympathy here. So if we freeze frame the posture and enlarge it here, we can see that the lead hand hook turns our body around the central axis, what used to be called the spine axis in old Xing Yiquan terminology. And there are lots of places you could go from here, but our focus at the moment is on more advanced footwork. So we can see here that as we're twisting one way, if we start to twist back the other, remember this each one idea of the movement on the left begins on the right and vice versa. Well, as the body drops down into the guard posture, that also involves pulling the left hand side of the body back towards the body, and that movement is highly structurally sympathetic with just continuing on with a step and the right hand side of the body stepping forwards into the jab. Watch again and you'll see that what's actually happening with the step is that we're sinking back into close, and then we're extending close into a step. So what would normally be a cross, we extend it into a step and it becomes a jab, kind of illusion jab.